that you have a little bit more control than you imagine that you do. And you definitely have the power to recognize the impact that these experiences, big T, little t, minute t, had in your life. Welcome to the Ignited Recovery Podcast, a new way forward for anyone looking for answers but feeling left out. If you've been searching for empowerment, triumph, and purpose, you've found them right here. You won't hear the same solutions, and you're not going to have any excuses to fall back on, because Ignited Recovery allows heroes to rise and become their best selves. I'm Dr. Adi Jaffe, and I can't wait to be your guide on this journey. Are you ready to become an ignited hero? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Ignited Recovery Secrets Podcast. I'm Adi Jaffe, and we're here to talk a little trauma today. So I'm just going to give a trigger warning in case anybody feels like this gets a little too much for you. I totally get it. Pause and then come back later. Or if it's too much, just don't come back at all. Go listen to some calming music or something along those lines, and take care of yourself. You know, I remember I was about 8 or 10 years old. It's the timing gets mixed up in my head, but I remember waking up one morning at home. We were still living in Israel, and I was about to leave my bedroom to go get water in the middle of the night. And as I was about to walk, I heard whispering, and we had this long hallway from my bedroom and my sister's bedroom to the living room. And as I was about to walk out, I saw my dad standing there holding 2 suitcases. He was in his army uniform, and my mom was standing in front of him, and they were talking. It was obviously an uncomfortable conversation. I couldn't really hear what they were saying. It was mumbly, but it didn't really feel like the right time to go get water. I could tell that. And so I tried to listen for a split second. I couldn't really hear what they were saying, and I went back to bed, and I went to sleep. And then my mom woke us up for school later that morning, just a couple of hours later, and she got me and my sister sitting on a bed together, and she told me that my dad had left us. And at first we just didn't understand what she was saying. We were like, well, yeah, dad always leaves. My dad worked all the time. We rarely saw him. He sometimes would even work weekends. And so, you know, we just said, okay, so he left. When is he coming back? And she said, no, he's not coming back. And my sister and I remember this, we just talked about it, if you guys heard the episode that I did with my sister Shirley a couple of months ago, but we looked at each other and we just started crying. This is before school. So we just started bawling. We're like, what do you mean he's not coming back? How is dad not coming back? That makes absolutely no sense. So we're crying, and our mom gave us a few minutes to cry. We're not a big crying family. And then she was like, okay, you got to get ready for school. And we were in shock. I mean, this completely upended the way we felt about the world at the time. And in the context of trauma, I think it's pretty safe to say I've had some traumatic moments, but this is one of the big ones for me. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about it here today in the opening is because the concept and the discussion of trauma has definitely become more and more commonplace, right? People didn't used to talk about this crap at all 20, 30 years ago, but now we're much more comfortable talking about it. But I think there's a nuance that we're missing, and it follows from the rest of the story. So within 3 days, my dad came back to live with us. It felt like 3 days. It could have been a week. It felt like 3 days at the time. And when he came back, he just came back home. Like, I just came home one day and my dad was home. Nobody talked about it. Nobody said why he came back. He was just back with us. And for decades, nobody talked about the fact that happened. So my parents were together until my dad passed about 10 years ago. They stayed together, even though this thing happened. And the reason that in the context of talking about trauma, I think this is an important thing to say is, I don't know if this happens to you, but when other people talk about trauma, I compare my trauma to theirs. What do I mean by that? Now, in retrospect, looking back, I always discount that experience. I always say, well, you know, my trauma wasn't that bad. My parents stayed together. But as I was telling that story, and as I was talking to my sister about it a couple of months ago on the podcast, it was really terrifying at the time. Like, it completely altered the way that I see the world. It definitely altered the way I saw the world back then. And so what I was thinking we can do here today is talk a little bit about that. Break down the idea of personal perspective in the context of trauma, the subjective impact that each one of us has, and then how that affects your present moment. And then I'm going to give you in the end an exercise like I've been doing the last couple of weeks to try to help you resolve any of these issues that you struggle with yourself. Sound good? Okay. So look, a lot of my friends had parents who divorced. So a lot of my friends who went through an experience like the one that I just described, their family didn't last, right? They didn't make it. My family did. And so it always felt like, well, I didn't have what's called big T trauma. I had little t trauma. My parents, yeah, they separated and my dad cheated on my mom, but they stayed together. And then I got to have kind of a whole nuclear family my whole life growing up. And it's really interesting in that discussion, especially given what I do, because I meet a lot of people who have massive trauma, like big T, when you have to actually increase the font, like at the beginning of a chapter of a book, big T, like it's just 5 times bigger than any other letter on the page, that kind of trauma. Long-term incest, sexual assault from the age of 5, 6, 7, growing up in war-torn regions where you were literally subjected to potential death every single day, having your parents disappear on you. I mean, like big trauma. And there's this almost like catch-22, because I feel like my trauma wasn't big enough, which in a weird sort of maladaptive, crazy way is also saying, well, I wish I had more of a reason for doing the things that I did later. But we kind of want our trauma small, right? And so I think the concept of personal perspective is really, really important here. And this is why I say that. Having worked with hundreds and thousands of people at this point, what I realize is it almost doesn't matter what the experience you had is. A lot of us end up considering that traumatic experience, small or big, normal. And it makes sense when you think about it. We grew up with that experience. It was normal for us. Look, if you grew up in a household where every day when you would come home, your dad was drunk and he would beat you, to me, that sounds subjectively terrifying because I never went through it. But you went home every day to that. And so you had to adjust. And so our personal perspective makes it so that we just consider any experience we had normal. I've made this reference before, I think, but if you watch the movie Room, you'll get a little bit of what I'm saying here. Most of us grew up in a house, in a neighborhood, we get to go outside, etc., but we consider that normal because that's what we went through. Any experience you have in your life, you will probably consider normal, especially if it went on for an extended period of time and you were young. That is completely different than the second concept, which is the subjective impact of that experience. What I found is that it almost doesn't matter what the experience you had was in terms of its enormity on your subjective experience in life, right? That moment with my mom and dad, my dad leaving us, it changed the way I saw marriage. It changed the way I saw my dad for about 20 years. It opened up this possibility to me that dad could leave at any given moment, which caused a lot of discomfort in our family and definitely was part of the reason why I decided to rebel later on against my dad, right? My parents stayed together and my dad came back, but the impact it had on me was large. In the same way that, one of my clients who was sort of in the sex trade from an early age, like elementary school early age, she had to figure out a way to deal with it. But without a doubt, being subjected to that experience had massive impact on the way she saw men, the way she saw sex, the trust she had in her parents, and the fact that they allowed some of this to happen. Massive impact. Yet, in conversations over and over with her, she'll talk about it like, well, yeah, that's just what I went through. because subjectively, in her perspective, that's the way her story unfolded. She couldn't see it any other way. And the reason I'm talking about it so much here is because what I find is a lot of people end up discounting their own trauma. Big T, little t, tiny t, massive T, doesn't matter. They end up really discounting it because they hear other people's experience and it feels more traumatic to them. But what I'm saying here to you is the only reason other people's trauma or personal experiences sound more impactful to you is because you didn't go through them, so you didn't get used to them. The people you're talking to would have oftentimes the exact same perspective on your experience, especially for a lot of people I work with. So I have some guiding questions to explain to you if what you experience falls under this psychological impact experience, right? Call it trauma if you want. Did it alter the way you see the world? Right? Like, did you have one version of the world before this experience happened, and then it had to change because of that experience? And I got to tell you, if that experience made you mistrust people, if it instilled fear in you, if it made you anxious or made you feel hopeless, then the answer is an absolute yes. The next question, did the experience cause you emotional pain? If it affected you when you were younger, it's likely affecting you right now unless you've already done the work to resolve it. Your brain doesn't just eliminate the fact that you had negative experiences because time passed. We wish it did, but it doesn't. And that follows into the next question. Do you sometimes wish that it never happened? You know, we get used to a lot of things from our past, but it's also natural to wish that part of our history just got removed. Like, I kind of wish I didn't go to jail. I kind of wish I didn't get held up at gunpoint. Unfortunately, reality won't let that happen, right? Reality will not let us just erase parts of the past. There's movies that have been created about it if you want to check those out, right? Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and whatnot. If you experience that sort of wishful thinking, like, man, I wish I didn't experience that, what your brain is telling you a little bit is it doesn't want to deal with the impact that came after it. So that means that there was impact. Now, the reason that's important is if you answered yes to any of those questions, especially if you answered yes to all three of them, your present moment is being affected by those previous experiences. Now, again, we can't erase them, but I think we can do something with them. And one of the things we need to do, and the things that I've found with my clients, is we have to face them head on, a little bit at least. We don't have to go back and make it a huge part of our everyday life to go consider these things, but we have to consider them a little bit. So here's my little exercise for you to take that personal impact this experience might be having on you right now and play with it. Just have a little active exercise to change the way you relate to it, okay? So here's the exercise. Now, if you're driving, you can't do this while you're driving. You're going to have to save this and go do it later. I want you to think about at least one of these negative experiences you've had in the past. Just spend a little time, pick one that you really want to focus on. For some of you, this will be obvious. For others, you'll have a little hard time figuring which one you want to pick. Then I want you to write the story on a piece of paper. Now, importantly, not the lesson. Don't write what you learned from the experience. Write the actual story. Some of you might want a really small piece of paper. Some of you will have 4 paragraphs to write. I don't really care. Write it so that it feels relatively complete for you. Then I want you to read over what you wrote, and I want you to circle the moments that caused you the most discomfort. Like, for instance, in my dad leaving, part of that was being woken up by my mom the next day before school and telling my sister and I that he wasn't coming back. Right? That was one of the most painful moments. So you circled those in your story. And now identify how those experiences affected the way you interact with the world today. So for instance, my dad, when he came back, nobody talked about it. One of the things that I learned through that experience was we don't talk about uncomfortable shit. Okay? Now, when you write that, and you might have a few of those in your story, I want you to spend a moment before the next part and recognize that this pattern, the way this experience affected how you interact with the world today, that pattern was instilled way back then. And unless you've dealt with it, you're probably still repeating it to some extent in your life right now. But here's the important part, and we'll have more episodes on this next topic that I'm going to cover. Notice that you're the person considering the experience. You're thinking about something that happened in the past, which also means you are not the experience. If you can think about something, you're not the thing, right? So do that with each one of the impacts that this experience left on you. And you'll have these circles and little notes around them. And when that's all done and you've recognized the patterns this included and introduced into your life, I want you to take the paper, I want you to crumple it, fold it up, put it in some fire-safe container, a metal or a glass bowl, put it in your fire pit if you have one, a fireplace, and I want you to burn it. And as you watch it burn, I want you to sit there and recognize the power you have over this experience and the power that you have over the patterns this experience has introduced into your life. You've written them down. You've recognized their impact. You identified how that still affects your life, and then you got rid of it in the fire. And just like you just burnt that paper, you have the power to alter the habits in your own life. You know, exercises like these, burning exercises, have been part of ceremonies in different cultures and different religions for a very, very long time. And there's a reason. There's a symbolism to be taking control of these things in your life. And I hope that doing this exercise for you, for yourself, in your life, given this experience right now, has shown you that you have a little bit more control than you imagine that you do. And you definitely have the power to recognize the impact that these experiences, big T, little t, minute t, had in your life. One of the things I know from all the people I've worked with is oftentimes we spend so much time running away from these experiences, we don't get to spend any time enjoying our lives. And hopefully this exercise helps you enjoy your life a little bit more and be tethered to this experience a little bit less. What I would love, as usual, if you don't mind, screenshot this, tag me or DM me, send me the impact, send me what you worked on, how it released you, and what you're going to be able to do now that maybe you weren't, maybe you were scared of before, maybe you were tethered, anchored, and you just couldn't fathom letting go of this. Thank you so much for joining me today. Have a great, great weekend. See you next week.
Thank you for tuning in to the Ignited Heroes Recovery Podcast. I really hope you found the information here useful and that we'll see you back here next week. And look, I want to make sure that this podcast is the most useful it can be for you, so please let me know by emailing info@ignited.com if there are any specific topics or questions you'd like to have addressed. As usual, if you like this episode, I would love for you to leave us a 5-star review and rating. Thanks, and see you next week.